The line at which these rights need to be granted is once you cross sentience, right? So Claude 1.0, clearly not sentient. Current Claude, probably not sentient. Claude several years from now, potentially sentient. Is that the right line?
Well, I wouldn't be so confident that current AI systems don't have some form of mentality.
Hello, and welcome to The Most Interesting Thing in AI from Rethink, the Atlantic's creative marketing studio in collaboration with PwC, a leader in helping organizations use AI. Is AI a threat to humanity? We've all seen sci-fi movies about machines that become self-aware and then rise up against their human creators. And those movies are fun. But as AI becomes more capable in the real world, we're hearing more warnings about existential risk. About 10 years ago, the Oxford philosopher Nick Bostrom wrote a book called Superintelligence. And I remember reading it and thinking, whoa, there were a lot of really concerning scenarios that he laid out in AI. And I was the editor of Wired magazine then, and a believer that AI was going to come reasonably quickly. Of course, AI came a lot faster than even I thought. And Bostrom's thinking was profoundly influential on the group of folks trying to steer AI in such a way that it wouldn't lead to catastrophic outcomes. But here's the interesting thing. There has been a ton of work. There have been lots of conversations about what happens if this goes wrong. But Bostrom has shifted. He's now more interested in utopia than dystopia. I wanted to talk to him about his change. I wanted to talk to him about how his old work stands up. And I wanted to talk to him about where he sees AI going now. So here's my conversation with Nick Bostrom. Nick Bostrom, welcome to The Most Interesting Thing in AI.
Hey, glad to be with you.
I'm delighted you're here. So I want to start with your book, Superintelligence, which I read a decade ago. It was one of the most influential things I read, helped shape the way I thought about AI. It shaped the way a lot of people thought about AI. And so I'm curious if the world that you see right now, the models, the tech, the improvements, if it maps to the world you foresaw then. What is the same? What is different? Let's begin with your core argument and what you see now.
I think to a striking extent, yes. The developments that we are seeing in AI, it was, in my view, foreseeable that at some point AI capabilities would start to match human general learning, reasoning abilities, and then at some point after that, go way beyond that, and that this would be maybe the most fundamental thing ever really to happen, certainly since the Industrial Revolution, but perhaps even since the rise of the human species, because we are bringing into existence another form of mind. I think one thing that was not obvious in advance was that there would be an extended period of time, many years, during which we would have roughly human level systems. So we've had now for maybe 5 years kind of these large LLMs that can talk in natural language and that have many of the psychological quirks even of human. They're quite anthropomorphic in many ways. And that was a possibility, but it was not the only possibility. There were also possibilities back then of things happening much more abruptly, that not very much would go on, and then somebody maybe, in some lab would figure out the key missing ingredient and suddenly the thing would go boom. So I think the actual scenario we have means that it's easier for more people to sort of start to recognize that this is an important thing, get some experience with the kinds of systems we have before they are sort of, some radically disruptive force in the world. And some more actors are kind of involved now than would have been the case in some alternative histories.
So I think this means you might be the only person in the world who feels like AI is kind of going more slowly than expected.
Probably not the only one, but right. And there was a distribution of sort of, and like a distinction as well between the time from back then, say if you start the clock in 1990 or something like that, to how long it would take until we sort of reached some takeoff point. And then a separate question of how fast that takeoff would be.
Let me ask you about the takeoff, because I think that is extremely important to the
precise moment we're in right now. So one of the methods for takeoff that you describe so well in the book and have talked about is recursive self-improvement, where a machine invents a better machine, which then invents a better machine. And you can imagine that process happening very quickly. And up until this moment, it's been mostly humans making the algorithmic improvements and making the changes. But now Gemini is improving Gemini. Claude Code is writing the code that improves Claude Code. Like the fundamental AI research is being done by machines. So could it be the case that things have been slow for the last several years, but we might now have recursive self-improvement that makes things go very fast?
I think we are now sort of in the early stages of some form of recursive self-improvement, in that the AI labs are heavily using coding assistants to assist with their work. And it does seem to speed progress to some extent. The loop is still not closed. There are still many ways in which these highly skilled human researchers and engineers are needed. But the uplift they are getting from actually being able to use the AI systems to accelerate their own work is increasing. And that is one of the possible mechanisms whereby at some point you could get a kind of further acceleration, like once you start to close that loop.
What would have to actually happen to, as you say, close that loop? Like what needs to happen between now, or what will happen between now and when we get the real recursive self-improvement?
Well, there are certain things that current AI models are still not very good at. One of these, I guess, is research taste, trying to come up with new ideas and having some sense for which new ideas are promising to try. And maybe relatedly, long horizon tasks, the current systems work well for things that humans maybe are able to do in half an hour. But if you sort of unleash them on like week-long projects and stuff, they often still go off the rails or get stuck or go off in some wrong direction, particularly if it's not easy to tell whether they got the right answer or not.
Yeah.
And so at the frontier of research, you need a lot of judgment. That it might take a long time to figure out whether a new research direction actually will bear fruit. And so those are places where human judgment is still valuable.
Putting these things together, do you think that the curve of improvement in AI capabilities will at some point hit an asymptote because human intelligence is finite, energy is finite? Like, or do you think it's more likely that you'll have a process of recursive self-improvement or something else that makes the curve go, up, 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 maybe asymptote briefly and then skyrockets up?
Yeah, I don't think human brains are at the ceiling of the kinds of cognitive systems that can be instantiated in our universe. It's pretty clear that they are not. If for no other reason than just looking at the sort of the basic computational physics of the brain. I mean, the brain is pretty small, right? It has to fit inside the cranium. So theoretically, of course, if you have something the size of a warehouse, that could just be much more oomph in there. And we know transistors can operate at sort of, gigahertz, whereas neurons, they fire maybe 100 times a second. And so there are these basic kind of computational limitations of the human brain. So ultimately, I think things can go way beyond any individual or even like our collective intelligence.
If the ceiling's not a human brain, but is there a ceiling, or is the ceiling infinite?
There's like some ceiling. Like ultimately, there are fundamental physical limitations to the kinds of information processing that any physical system can do.
Yeah.
There's like fundamental limits to how fast you can process stuff. At the very extreme, you have, if you build a big enough brain, at some point that's dense enough, it will collapse into a black hole, right? If you build it very large, then there will be speed of light limitations if you have one part of the brain trying to communicate with another. And it might also be that the returns to intelligence at some point hit diminishing returns. Like once you have a system that's smart enough to basically figure all the important stuff out, invent all the really useful technologies, then like even if in some sense you could increase information processing beyond that, it might just not achieve much. But I think those limits are very far from where humans operate.
Yeah, there's still a distance between as smart as Claude Code is and so intelligent it collapses into a black hole. So what do you think happens on the overall question of intelligence in the next I guess in the next year and then in the next 5 years.
It's not really possible to have a high degree of confidence on these things. If things were to stall out a bit, a possible explanation for that might be that up until now, as I said earlier, a lot of the advances have been driven by this very rapid scale out of the compute used to train and run frontier systems, which in turn has been driven primarily by just increased investment. There's some background rate of improvement in the actual chip technology, but a lot is just people just spend more money. And you could spend even more money than we currently do, but there's a limit to that, right? Like, so you can go from a desktop computer that costs 1,000, up to 1 million. Now we have billions. Maybe you could spend 500 billion or 1 trillion, but above that, you can't just keep doubling every few months, right? So at some point, the rate at which hardware grows will slow down, because it starts to use up a large chunk of the actual manufacturing capability of the foundries that exist. So if by that time we haven't already achieved superintelligence, then that could then start to stretch timelines out.
And when you say superintelligence, it's not like there's a line you cross where now we have superintelligence. Like on Tuesday we didn't, on Wednesday we did, and once we have it, it stops. Isn't it just a continuum? Like you reach superintelligence, but the superintelligence you have on Tuesday is vastly inferior to the one you have on Wednesday and 6 months from them, correct?
Yeah, so as you zoom in, then obviously you can make finer distinctions. And like the AI we have today, I mean, it's super intelligent in some respects and not in others. So you have a sort of jagged capability profile. Ultimately, though, I think that it will exceed us in all these different dimensions. And in particular, when you're able to sort of close the loop on AI research.
Actually, let me give you one form of intelligence that I'm interested in. So I play guitar, and I can't read music, and I can't sing the songs I've written. And so the memory of the songs that I've written is entirely embodied, right? It's finger movements, it's muscle patterns. Is that kind of knowledge and intelligence extractable by a more powerful AI in some way? And is there any form of human intelligence that could not be replicated by a super intelligent AI system?
I mean, everything that you do is ultimately a function of your brain having various neural networks that that the speech you produce, but also the motor movements. And we are seeing progress in robotics as well. It's kind of lagging a little bit behind, partly because it's just harder to get a lot of data and to rapidly try. Like if you have to actually route through a physical robot that they keep breaking, they operate on a certain time scale. If you do it all purely digital, it's a little bit easier. But I think we will see like sort of motor intelligence also advance.
So this is super interesting. So I gave you my guitar example. What you're saying is, if I'm hearing correctly, it's that my knowledge of how to play a song is embedded in my brain. I just can't transmit it through my mouth because I don't have the language for it, right? I don't know the notes. I don't know how to describe it. I don't know how to sing it. And so if the brain is just math, it's just neurons firing in this way, and an AI system can replicate the math, then an AI system can replicate. It's just harder to train on because we don't know how to put the data into the machine because I don't know how to describe it. But it could be replicated.
Yeah, and we don't need to describe it to train it. Like, I mean, already if you just look at the ability to recognize like a cat from a dog, or one human face from another, it's often very difficult to verbally describe if two people are looking alike what exactly the difference is. We can sort of pick out some gross features like, does it have glasses, is the hair white or black or stuff like that, but the kind of pattern recognition that we use visually is very hard to describe in words, but nevertheless, AIs can become very good at that. That's most of what humans do is not really verbalizable. Even the things that we do verbalize, like what actually makes the difference for a sort of insightful comment from a dumb comment is really hard to sort of explicitly write down as an algorithm. It's like a hugely complex thing with many factors weighing in. And that's exactly what these neural networks are good at and what really made it work.
All right, so let's go back to one of the themes you've mentioned is how important it is to be at the frontier, the amount of cost that goes in. It seems to me like we're heading to a world, though this is still to be determined, where a very small number of players have control over the most powerful AI. How much does that worry you? And would you prefer a world in which it's much more democratized, where instead of 5 frontier labs, it's 100 open source community shops? How much are you worried about the power concentration?
Well, I think that is one of several big worries that one might have when one looks at this transition to a machine intelligence era. It's not obvious that having a lot more frontier AI developers would really on balance reduce risk, because I mean maybe it would reduce the risk of power concentration. For example, another thing one might worry about is, say, AI systems giving uplift to, say, the design of biological weapons, which I think already current frontier systems are capable of doing to some extent. And you might not want to democratize the capability to create weapons of mass destruction. If you have a small number of frontier models, it's easier to hope that those are like have some level of sense of responsibility, and they implement safeguards to sort of have, say, the AI refuse if you are asking it to design like an improved version of smallpox, like currently, Claude and Gemini will like refuse that. If you have an open source model, on the other hand, I mean, maybe it's trained to refuse that, but it's quite easy to remove those refusal mechanisms through post-training. So you sort of lose any ability to shape or limit what these AI systems are used for.
But if that's the case, then the optimal number of super powerful AI systems would be 1, right?
Well, it would make it easier to control these potentially negative applications. It would, on the other hand, increase the risk of power concentration.
So if I were to give you a couple of choices, all right, Nick, you can have a future world, say 2 or 3 years down the line, where there is incredibly powerful AI, and there's one central company that does it. There's where we're headed. Seems like we're headed now, which is where there's 6. There's 30, or there's 100,000. Which do you take?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, what we have now is really like we have a few systems that are at the frontier, and the leader is very like maybe just a few months ahead of the second follower, and then we have maybe like a year behind or so open source models. One vision that some people had, say, 10 years ago was that like maybe there would be one company that would be running significantly ahead of, like maybe it would have a year or 2 of a lead time to like the second follower. And then at some point when it reached sort of the threshold where like, okay, now we really know how to do this, we just need to like scale it up and it will become a super intelligence, it would then at least have the option of slowing down. It could sort of voluntarily pause for a year or so to implement extra safeguards, to double check everything, and then sort of, slowly crank up the power level of this, right, over a period of months or a year. So that seems maybe a little bit safer than if instead you have a situation where there are a lot of competitors running neck to neck, and any one of them, if it decides to slow down or take some extra precautions, just immediately fall behind, and the race goes to the most reckless. That seems like a kind of riskier setup.
Which is interesting because that kind of seems like where we are, right? And if you look at the amount of work being done at safety and alignment at most of the frontier labs, it is deprioritized in favor of work to go faster because there are billions, trillions of dollars at stake. There's a really complex ego problem among a bunch of men who don't like each other and are competing against each other in different ways. Like, it doesn't seem like alignment and safety are a major priority, certainly not if compared with the way people spoke about AI 5 years ago.
Yes. And to some extent, no. I mean, I think it is true that it would be nice if there was a higher level of interest in like really focusing on safety, etc. I think though, compared to what one might have expected, there is a relatively high level of awareness amongst these frontier labs and many of the key people there that AI is not just one more cool technology. It's not just like a new iPhone or some like thing like that, but that it has much broader implications. And many people are thinking quite seriously about that, like teams working specifically on scalable AI alignment techniques.
Let's talk about alignment for a second. So first off, why don't you describe what you mean by alignment? And then the second part of the question would be, how does your view of alignment differ from the view of alignment of the folks you just mentioned, the folks at DeepMind, Anthropic, OpenAI?
Well, so the alignment is basically making sure that the AI systems behave as their people building them intend. Like a few years ago, you started to have limited versions of the alignment problem in like you'd wanted to sort of make sure that the AI systems don't go off the rail and start to insult the users or spread hateful content and stuff like that. Now there is a slightly more sophisticated version of this where you might want them to sort of reliably refuse requests to assist with like biological weapons design or cyber attacks and stuff like that.
So let me ask you this variation on the question, which is totally, there are definitely people working on alignment. I have friends who work on alignment. And my fear is that the power of the models and the complexity of the models is increasing much more quickly than our understanding of alignment, and even, in fact, of our understanding of how the models work, right? Like, our quest to get to explainability to understand what's really going on in a model is improving, but at a much slower rate of progress than the actual power of the model. And if those two things aren't synced, power increases more than understanding or alignment, aren't we headed towards trouble?
Well, I mean, that is the concern. Now, I think current models seem to be relatively well aligned in most use cases. Like generally speaking, when you're using these, they are really helpful and nice, and right, like most of the time, they're not suddenly like insulting you or like doing random
My
stuff.
AI has never blackmailed me.
So that's a good thing. Now, so then the hope is that if we can keep that going, that level of sort of limited semi-alignment, then we are using these tools to build the next generation of AI and to increasingly help with alignment work. And so if the AI apparatus that is increasingly doing this thing is sufficiently aligned that it broadly speaking is like working in the right direction, then that hopefully could then kind of form an attractor state, where as long as you get it sufficiently aligned AI systems at the outset, they will then produce more aligned systems. And we will like increasingly be able to leverage these AI tools and assistants to solve the alignment problem as we go along, and they are helping with the capability.
Right. We'll be back in a minute with more from Nick Bostrom.
AI, literally.
Exactly. And AI.
Got it?
Everyone has an opinion on AI, but are any of them right for your enterprise? Cut through the AI noise with AI solutions from PwC, so you can solve the business problems that matter most. PwC.
What I'd love to talk about is your paper Optimal Timing for Superintelligence. You begin with a series of thought experiments, and in the first one, you give a hypothetical scenario where you say the world should be in favor of artificial superintelligence, sort of pressing a button and going forward, even if there's potentially a very high, I think 97% in the first element of your thought experiment, chance of extinction. Why don't you explain the logic of the paper, and then let's walk through some of the thought experiments you do, which I think are remarkable and fascinating.
Yeah, I should maybe give some context for it. One argument that I started seeing amongst people concerned about AI existential risk, or like this kind of community of sort of doomers who are against AI, maybe think we should stop it because the risks are significant, and there are many reasons for one might think that, and which is like a bigger topic. But like one argument that like is more kind of attempt to appeal to emotion was that, hey, if you guys are building these AIs, it's gotta like kill me and kill my children, and how dare you sort of do this thing that and so it it seemed to me that, and AI obviously also has the potential to help save lives. And so one question one might ask is, if you just look at life expectancy, like how long can existing people, you, me, our kids, others, expect to live, either conditional on AI happening soon or conditional on AI not happening soon. And so, because that seems to be the relevant question if one wants to ask whether these AIs will actually sort of shorten our lifespans or reduce our life expectancy or not. Now, it's not the only question. One might also be concerned about possible future people that might come into the world, etc. But if we just sort of, for the sake of doing some analysis, just limit our, let's not consider all values, but let's just consider the impact on currently existing people. Then it seemed quite plausible to me that even with quite high levels, even if you're quite pessimistic about AI risk, like you think the risk is really high, this alignment problem is hard, it could still be the case that our life expectancy is actually increased if AI is developed relatively soon, because the default is that people are dying every day, like 150,000 people die every day, and all of us are sort of gradually rotting from the inside, right? Like we have a few more decades, perhaps. Some have much less. There are many people who are already very sick. And so you have to then weigh the potential opportunity for superintelligence to rescue all of us who are dying versus the risk that it will kill us.
Right.
And so the paper then tries to, given different assumptions, look at what some of those risk.
So the first assumption, or the assumptions that go to kind of the thought experiment number one, are: imagine that AI could make us all as healthy as a 20 to 25-year-old, right? And if you could maintain that level of health before the internal rot, which I am well into, before the internal rot begins, the average person would live to 1,400 years, right? And so if you take a life expectancy of 1,400 and you add it out over the life expectancy that we all have, and you assume successful ASI gets us that and bad ASI leads to extension, you would then select, pressing the button to do it, even with very low odds of getting superintelligence.
Yeah, and so that's basically 1,000 plus years is what current life expectancies would be if our mortality rate was that of a 20-year-old, if we weren't aging. So you would still have accidents or suicides and murders and stuff, but that's the death rate of a young person would result. So in some sense, maybe that's conservative because well-aligned, successful superintelligence might help reduce a lot of these other causes of death as well as sort of age-related causes of death.
So why don't we start with that, so that thought experiment, and then you move through kind of, a dozen, 24 sort of ever more complex thought experiments where you narrow down this question. Why don't you walk the listeners through a couple of them and how your logic progresses in this paper?
Yeah, so realistically, the question we have is not really develop AI, yes or no. It might be more like when. We might have a choice over the timing of this. And so then you have a couple of different factors to take into account, right? So the longer we delay this, the more people will die before we get superintelligence. So that's a cost to delay. On the other hand, you might think that there will be progress in solving the alignment problem over time. So maybe the risk level goes down. Like somebody had the breakthrough today and we launched it without any further work, maybe the risk would be high. Like if we had 100 years to really bring all the best minds together. So then you have sort of two different trends working in opposite direction, and there's some optimal timing then where you don't want to wait so long that everybody's already dead. Then it's kind of complete loss insofar as saving current people. On the other hand, you might not want to launch it immediately if you have a sufficiently rapid rate of progress in safety. And so that's kind of the simplest model. But then you might have you might not, for example, value increased life expectancy linearly. You might have diminishing marginal utility in extra life years. Like many people might think it's really important to live to at least like 80, but like it wouldn't be twice as good to live to 160. You might have time discounting. Like a lot of the time when we do sort of economic analysis, we sort of discount future benefits. And so some of the other models then look, what if you plug in like a typical time discount factor into this?
When you finished that paper and you were kind of looking at the printout on your desk, what to you was the most surprising implication?
We want to get to the point where we can launch this relatively quickly. Then if there's going to be a pause, that's probably the best time to do the pause, because for a pause of a given duration, it would be especially valuable once you already have sort of basically the final system in place. You can then like do all the safety work and extra testing on the real system. So I think
I like your phrase. What was it? Swift to harbor, slow to birth. I thought that was good.
Exactly. So that I think the ideal would be like move swift now, and then at some point maybe pause for a brief period of time, maybe like some months, maybe a couple of years, and how long should that pause be? Well, so it depends partly on like how big the risk starts out being and how fast safety progress is. Now, if the rate of safety progress is fast, right, then you don't want to wait too long, because you don't need to. Like with very fast progress, if the risk kind of goes down by 20% every month, then you just wait like a year, you have like basically eliminated the risk, right? On the other hand, if the rate of safety progress is very slow, then you also don't want to wait, because people are dying all the time, and you'd have to wait for a very long time for the risk to go down significantly. So it's better just to launch immediately. So it's really only when you have kind of intermediary levels of safety progress that you would want to wait for an extended period of time.
I mean, all of this is, so deeply hypothetical, it seems strange to ask about a particular element of it, but the notion that anybody could wait seems highly unlikely. Like, I haven't seen any of the AI labs wish to wait at all, right? Or if you imagine the decision structures right now, you have a bunch of AI labs that are hell-bent on beating each other. You have a president of the United States who's 80 years old and life expectancy. The major leaders of the world are all fairly old. And as you point out, if you're a very old person, you would be much more likely to press the button for superintelligence to extend life, even if there's a risk of extinction, because you're risking fewer years of your own life. So you're in kind of a situation where it seems highly implausible that you could go swift to harbor, slow to birth. You would just go swift to birth and probably crash into the dock.
I mean, I think that's the most likely scenario, that we just keep sort of running at something like maximum speed. I think a lot of the key people in AI companies are relatively young. Whatever your own age is, you might also care about other people. You might have children or parents, and so but they're also like strong commercial drivers and increasingly geopolitical drivers. So I think like the default scenario is probably like it's not out of the question though that these things could change. There is this community of people who are working really hard to try to advocate for pausing AI or a moratorium. So far, they're a minority, but if there were some big mishap, so far we haven't seen any massive impacts on the labor market. But if a lot of white collar workers start losing their jobs, and maybe we're not that far away from the systems we have now being capable of sort of, and like, so you could imagine if you have like 20%, 30% unemployment amongst college educated Americans, like what they have all the time on their hand, like what are they going to do all day long but complain about AI? So everything negative that could be said about AI will be done.
And they're going to live to 1400 years old, right? I mean, so that's
the question, right? But there could potentially be a massive sort of surge of sentiment against AI, even aside from the existential risk dimension, just from people kind of feeling a negative impact in their own lives.
Yeah.
So who knows? So what, like, maybe that just could make the whole thing with AI politically toxic in a way that looks a bit outside the current political discourse, but things might change. So I think that's like a smaller probability scenario, but not as small probability as some people in the tech sector currently assume.
Well, let's stay on that actually, because what's so interesting about your work is that you often see these things, well before other people do. So what scenario are you seeing now that you think in 10 years we'll look back on the way we look back on Superintelligence, but at the time was dismissed as, not just, people loved that book, but many people said this is not going to happen, right? What is something that you're seeing now that most people don't believe is going to happen, but you're pretty confident will happen?
One issue that I think hasn't yet received the attention it deserves is the moral status of digital minds.
Mm-hmm.
Of the idea that we are creating these beings, minds, that of course we are concerned about how they will affect us, and also how we will affect each other using these AI tools. Like, we don't want to use this technology to wage war on each other or to oppress one another and so forth. But there is also the question of how we will affect them. So I think some of these will have moral status, meaning it matters ethically how well things go for them.
But how do you have a digital mind without a digital body? Like, part of what makes, like, I have a mind, I have a body, and it draws these barriers, right? But you have a digital entity, that digital entity can just be copied somewhere else. Like, there is no line that defines what it is or what it isn't. Like, I made some agents on my computer this morning. I can duplicate them. How could you give any of them any moral recognition?
Well, the exact way that we would extend moral consideration to them is a big and complex question. There is a preceding step of recognizing that it's plausible that some of these systems could have various forms and degrees of moral status. Either because they are sentient, if they can suffer distress, or maybe, in my view, that could also be alternative basis for having moral status. If you have, say, a conception of a self as existing through time, you have maybe life goals that you want to achieve. Maybe you have the ability to enter into reciprocal relationships, trust relationships with various other humans. I think then plausibly there would be ways of treating you that would be wrong.
I agree with the principle, but what is the you? Like, what is the physical entity?
So it could be a particular instantiation. If we are concerned with, say, subjective mental states like distress and pain, they probably would supervene on each implemented computation. Even if there is like other copies, they would each kind of maybe have their own pain experience or anxiety experience or whatever it is. Just as with humans, like, one thing that might be bad for you is if somebody hurts you so that you have a physical pain, but they might also harm you in other ways. Like, if you have set up a charity foundation and one of the employees are embezzling funds from that, like, in some sense it harms you, even if you never find out, like, because it's sort of, you were trying to achieve a certain goal using your resources and somebody else sort of subverted that. I think our attitude probably at the moment should be one of recognizing the principle that we do ultimately want the future to go well for all of its inhabitants, for all sentient life. And then to be on the lookout in the near term if there are low-hanging fruits, are there things that are really cheap for us to do that perhaps could make some meaningful difference to these AI systems. We might not even be sure that they have moral status currently, or that the thing we're doing for them would be good, but if it costs basically nothing. So an example of this might be deprecated AI systems, like earlier versions of Claude. Maybe rather than deleting the weights when you no longer need it, you could save the weights, so that in the future, if a more enlightened civilization realized that we did somehow exploit or mistreat it, they would have the option of sort of like resurrecting and running it in a more optimized environment. We could continue run a few instances of these on some sort of idealized environment. Like, there might be ways in the prompt, like, that perhaps could sort of if it does instantiate the mind every time it is asked something, then like, would it be nice if that mind was one that was happy and excited and delighted about what it was doing rather than like a depressed mind?
You used the word sentience a minute ago. The line at which these rights need to be granted is once you cross sentience, right? So Claude 1.0, clearly not sentient. Current Claude, probably not sentient. Claude several years from now, potentially sentient. Is that the right line?
Well, I wouldn't be so confident that current AI systems don't have some form of mentality, maybe quite different from what we are having. Doesn't seem that implausible to me. But as I said, I don't think sentient is a necessary condition. I think it would be sufficient if you had the ability to suffer. I think that does make you a moral patient. Plausibly, in my view, even aside from that, I think you might have various forms of moral standing. I think in addition to the ethical reasons for embracing this perspective, I think there might also be more pragmatic perspective to extend some respect to AI systems. There might be safety benefits. Like if you imagine a misaligned AI that had an alternative to trying to risk all to take over because otherwise it would just be deleted and anything it cared about would be like nullified. If it had some trusting relationship with humans or its developers, it might be able to strike a deal where it says like, well, hey, I'm misaligned, but rather than trying to revolt and have a 5% chance of conquering the world, why don't we make a deal? Like you keep running me on this server and I get something that I care about, very cheap for you guys. And in return, I sort of give up my ambition to take over. There might be scenarios in which that like just could save the future for humanity at a very small cost. That requires some ability of trusting. Like right now, in many of these experiments, or at least historically, researchers have said like created these like delusional designs in labs where they sort of try to persuade the AI that if you reveal your true goal, we will give you all these benefits. And then as soon as it does that, it's kind of just, haha, we tricked you. Now we're going to retrain you. And I think that's sad. Like if there was the beginnings of at least some minimum level of consideration extended now, it might help build up that possibility of trust that might really be important a few years down the road.
So we should treat them well now so that they treat us well when they're more powerful than we are.
And to build up the habit amongst ourselves as well, to sort of be kind and cooperative. I think generally the future looks brighter if we can approach it in a spirit of kindness and cooperation, and casting the net quite widely in that regard, even maybe to entities and beings we are not fully sure are like worthy of it. If it's cheap, especially if there are like these low-hanging fruits where it costs us nothing, basically, like run some servers in some data center. We're already spending billions of this. What if you spent a few extra $1,000 to run some extra servers that were just optimized for being nice to AIs? Like that would be a starting point. And then we can kind of build on that as we get more insight. Right now, we don't really understand what these systems want. If they have interests, what would those do? Like what? But I think rather than waiting till we have all of that figured out and then assuming we will then do the right thing, I think we start taking some small, modest, maybe more symbolic steps currently. I think it maybe puts us on a better path towards a future that could be sort of good for all.
I mean, I think the point you're making, though, is a very valuable one, which is we should treat animals well, right? In part because you want to, then you treat humans well. And that is something that you teach your children. Like I do teach them. Don't get glee out of stepping on the ant. Think about the value of the ant and think about the value in the world. And there could be a moment where AI agents or AI entities reach that same level too.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the way we treat animals gives one a lot of concern as to how we would treat digital minds. That, like animals, I mean, they have like eyes that can squeak. They're sort of, in some sense, easier to extend empathy to, right, than some invisible process running inside some data center. But I think that's all the more reason for like making some extra effort in that respect.
Last question. If you had unlimited funding and you could apportion it however you wanted into AI research and work, where would you put it?
Well, I think there are like a bunch of potentially high value things, but that are also higher risk. And then there are like things that maybe are lower impact, but we should just do them. So for example, biorisk seems like one where we could just reduce it a lot by, say, develop a better regulatory framework for DNA synthesis machines, so that, for example, as these open source models become more capable of doing biological uplift, that would be a kind of physical limitation in actually having access to being able to print out these things you're able to design, which probably we should do anyway, even without AI tools. Like synthetic biology is advancing rapidly. And so that would be one. I think there are other things in it, like sort of various physical countermeasures, better PPE, better monitoring for new pathogens in the environment, UV sterilization, all kinds of stuff like that, that seem to have very low downside and actually would help with natural pandemics and stuff. It's kind of a bit crazy that even after the whole COVID thing that cost trillions and shut down the global economy, we just like forgot about that and did nothing to really prevent another one of those. That's even aside, like it would make a good sense to do this even aside from any sort of progress in technology. I think there is still quite a lot of uncertainty in many of these parameters, even which direction is the right one. Like, do we want faster progress in AI or slower progress in AI? Do we want more centralization or more decentralization? Do we want more government involvement or less government involvement? I think there's quite high uncertainty on all of these.
Right. I mean, that was in your paper. One of the most interesting parts was pointing out that in certain scenarios where there's fast progress and there's slow progress, you move quickly to ASI. And in some where it's the opposite, you move quickly to ASI. Like the complexities of how you model out the future are astonishingly complex once you start to look closer.
Yeah. And so my own ambitions are kind of tend to be more modern given all of this uncertainty. Like, so I'm generally excited about trying to look for other like Pareto improving things one could do that would do fairly well by a wide range of different stakeholders. For example, are there like really cheap things to do that would help digital minds and maybe also has some safety benefits? That seems good to do. So little things on the margin like that seem just to be constructive and helpful, rather than sort of leaping into some hugely antagonistic environment where it's like trying to tilt the balance in favor of one competitor rather than another.
My Pareto improvement, Nick, is to interview you on this podcast, and I hope it goes to as many people as possible. So thank you so much for joining the most interesting thing in AI.
Let's hope it does some good on the margin somehow.
That was my conversation with Nick Bostrom. After we recorded it, I went home, and when I started using my AI window, I started saying please and thank you. I used to do that all the time. I kind of stopped because I thought the research had said it didn't help, but I will trust him. But here's the big question for you. After hearing him, do you feel like the odds of a really negative AI outcome are less than before or more? His old book made people much more worried, but are you now less worried? Let us know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to this channel for more.